We are live.
Oh, all right. Good morning, everybody.
Good
Uh,
morning.
this
Morning.
is Rico Manalo with All Aces on Air. Got some special guests with me today. I have Dr. Stellan Vinthagen and Dr. Atyia Martin of All Aces, who is here as a guest and not as an interviewer. Really excited about today's show. The title of it is Resistance 2020. And in this show, we are planning to explore the intersections of resistance and racial equity. So to begin, I'm going to introduce Dr. Stellan Vinthagen. Most people have heard of scholar practitioners, and while Dr. Stellan Vinthagen could be called a scholar practitioner, he is the only person I know of who is recognized as a scholar activist in an official capacity. Dr. Vinthagen serves as the Inaugural Endowed Chair in the study of nonviolent direct action and civil resistance and Director of the Resistance Studies Initiative at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. That was a long sentence. Then we've got,
Well done, Rico.
thank you very much. I did practice. We've got, of course, Dr. Martin, probably familiar to a lot of people who have been following the show or All Aces in general. But for those who are not familiar, Dr. Atyia Martin is a certified emergency manager. That's the CEM after her name. She is also the former chief resilience officer for the city of Boston, as well as the CEO and founder of our company, All Aces, which is an alternative to traditional diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting and professional development. In addition to her work with All Aces, Dr. Martin teaches at Northeastern University and is in fact an activist in her own right. So now that introductions are out of the way, Stellan, could you please help our audience to understand a little bit better what resistance actually is, or what does it mean?
All right. So a simple understanding of it would be that we are talking about practices that people are doing that is undermining forms of domination. So it can be things that people are saying or doing otherwise that is in some way, at least temporarily, undermining sexism, racism, homophobia, or similar forms of domination in society.
Very cool, very cool. And so if we can also introduce to our audience or frame for it in clear terms, Dr. Martin, what exactly is racial equity? A lot of people might be conflating that term with diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, but that's not quite the sense that we've come to understand.
Yes. So racial equity is explicitly about addressing racism, right? And so if we're talking about what it is, we have to understand what racism is, how it works, how it's impacting all of us, how it's impacting our organizations, and how it's impacting our entire society. So that when we're talking about, well, what do you do about that? Allegedly, that's racial equity. And so that means that we have to unlearn a lot of ways that we think about ourselves and the world so that we're not centering whiteness or kind of these different forms of conformity. Standards of conformity, that we are rethinking how we see ourselves, our power, the way that we show up to engage, excuse me, with other people in spaces, and that we change the dynamics of how organizations operate, because organizations then have all of those other dynamics in it. The ideas about how people are supposed to be, the interactions between people. And so it requires us to shift in a way that allows all of us to reach our full human potential. And so the locus of control is really with us as individuals, when then how we collectively decide to be when we're in spaces together. And so advancing racial equity really is about reimagining who we are as people, who we are in organizations, and when we're in groups, and really committing ourselves to close the gap between who we want to be and who we are today. And that's an ongoing, constant process.
So when I hear Stellan talk about domination, and when I hear you, Dr. Martin, talk about the way things should be, are there are those the same thing? Are there parallels, or like how is it that
Mhm.
resistance and racial equity kind of intersect? And I'm opening that up to both of you.
You want to go first, Ellen? I'll go first.
You go
So
for it.
uh, there's a framing that we use at all ACEs when we talk about racial equity and what we're supposed to be doing about it. And we say that any one of us, whether you're a person of color, white person, can be a passive conductor of racism, right, or oppression. And some of us do it less passively and proactively. Um, but for the most of us, we're acting as passive conductors of oppression, and there's a lot of ways that we do that. And so when we think about domination, right? It's usually the way that we kind of work together with the system without meaning or even realizing that's what we're doing, is when we kind of go along with what the expectations are that society has for us. And when it comes to racism, it's that you, as a person of color and whatever race or ethnicity you fall into, are going to show up. You're going to do as you're told, and you're going to fall into these roles. And for white people, that you're going to show up and you're going to have all the answers, and you're going to kind of uh, uh, show up in a way that takes control of the room and all of these things. So these dynamics are really a part of the way domination plays out, and a part of the ways that where we have the biggest opportunities to shift those dynamics as proactive disruptors of oppression, right? And that's where you get to pushing back against that domination, that status quo idea about who is allowed to have humanity, dignity, and power in certain spaces. And so, how do we take back our control and our power and our agency in those moments?
I fully agree. I mean, I think we have to be clear that these forms of domination can be so pervasive and historical and shifting in its form and articulations by that it's happening inside of us as persons, particularly if you're a white male middle class like me. It takes place inside of my body and my frame and thinking. It also happens in the social interactions between people at the workplace, neighborhood, and family. But it's also a part of a system that is a global system, national system that is upheld by economic structures and political institutions. So because of this, we need to be creative and we need to have complex understandings when we are adopting resistance, and we need to work long term in order to deal with this on several levels at the same time.
And I'm really interested in um, this idea of resistance in practical ways. So,
Right.
so far we've been talking about kind of the definitions, the framing. I'm curious about kind of the work that you've done, and some examples so that the audience has a better sense of when we're the connection between the intellectual side of it and then and this is what it looks like in the real world.
Sure. Okay. So when people think about resistance, people tend to think about protest. Um, you have the masses walking in the street shouting their slogans.
Mhm.
Sometimes people think about burning cars and riots. So that's kind of the perceptions that people have about resistance. But that is a very limited understanding. And I think we need to be clear that there's a very huge difference between the protest power and the politics of demand when we are trying to tell those people in power that they need to change. They need to create maybe more of anti-racist policies or so. And the kind of people power that I think ultimately resistance is all about. Resistance is something that needs to go beyond the idea of protest, appealing to the powerful, and instead recognizing the power that exists with us as individuals and collectives, communities. All right. So if we think like that, it becomes much more important to kind of expand the repertoire and be clear about, for example, that there is an everyday aspect to resistance, right? We spend our days at workplaces, in neighborhoods, and in families, and there we are encountering racism and sexism and homophobia, right? Mm-hmm. So just to give an example, very practically, our unions might be fighting for better working conditions and better salaries for people that are doing low-paid work. But there is a practice that is not being really recognized and noticed, and that is that people that feel exploited at their workplace, they tend to work slower and less efficient when they're not under surveillance.
It's true.
Right. So in that way, when people do that, they're actually maybe writing private letters. They may be phoning their friends, and in that way they have less work hours. And in that way, they're actually practically raising their own salary because they do less hours than actually what's being booked. So that's just one example.
Yeah, not to get like, well, gross here, but I did once work with a colleague who, whenever he came into work, he would head immediately for the bathroom. And so I asked him if it was like a long commute, and he smilingly told me, like, I get paid to do this. And it's like, I suppose you just did, sir. I suppose you just did. But it's really interesting seeing that action now take on some aspects of resistance, because I think until I read some of your work, I hadn't really thought of it that way. But connected to my own cultural background, that framing of everyday resistance, it really kind of helped me see how a book that was written to parody the Spanish occupation led to a movement called people power. So that was very helpful in my own understanding.
Yeah, it actually reminds me of so in our household we call this I shouldn't say this out loud, so let me not say that. But what I will say what I will say is that it's a pattern we've seen throughout time, even with the transatlantic slave trade. Formerly enslaved Africans, or at the time enslaved Africans, would always do these acts of resistance. Unlock the gates to where the livestock were, and then when the so-called slave master would come and try to figure out what was going on, they played off the fact that they thought that the slave master thought they were stupid, right? And be like, we don't know what happened, right? But yep. There would always these moments of resistance, and some of it even looked like just letting folks think that they were smarter and letting them do harm to themselves. So I read one story. There's a great book. It's Lay My Burdens Down. It's a really old book that I have, and it tells some stories from in the voices of formerly enslaved people, Africans. And one of the stories that sticks out to me is there was a again, so-called slave master who would didn't know anything about the machinery on the plantation. And there was one of the gentlemen on the plantation who did, right? And he was enslaved African. And so he was like the expert. So it wasn't working one day, and the guy's working on it. Slave master comes over and he's like, move out of the way, I got this. And the guy was like, and he started to stop him, but he was like, no, I'm just going to let him. So he steps back, and he's tinkering with the machinery, and it explodes. Right. And so slave master was instantly killed. and the enslaved African, got injured, but he survived. But it was one of those things where even just letting people think they they know stuff that they really don't know anything about, and doing harm to themselves because they don't want to listen. And so, how do we translate that into the real world? We're not advocating for folks to cause death. Um, but this idea of what are the other tangible ways that people can be proactive. So I'll fast forward to today, and some of the work that I've been involved with, wearing another hat, my nonprofit hat, in Boston, and working with the Black Boston COVID-19 Coalition, and supporting that work, and really. I don't think I, growing up, ever fully understood the power of when people come together. um, Hey, there's Larita. Hey, Larita, good to see your post up there. Um, but as we think about, when I was growing up, I didn't really fully understand collective power. Like, I read about it, I knew it intellectually, but over the years, I've seen it in practice, and I think the work that I've done with the coalition has been most rewarding. It's hard, and I'm not saying that we're always winning, but the having that counterbalance to government and other traditional forms of power, to hold them accountable, is really important in every way that we can speak up when there are injustices, when we can say this is what the issue really is, and this is where there are opportunities for us to really shift the dynamics here. um, Without that, the people keep doing what they've always been doing, which we know perpetuates inequities, whether they mean to or not. It's not because people are bad people and they wake up that morning and they're, twisting their eyebrows like, I want to, ruin the world, right? Or oppress people.
Twirling their mustaches.
Twirling the mustache, right? So, so it's really been a pleasure to see kind of what does it look like on the ground level. And I'm going to stop there because I'm interested in some of the work that Stellan has done on the ground and supporting different types of movements, groups who are in communities trying to do this kind of work.
Yeah, but I mean, I totally think you're right that this kind of collective organization and articulation of people's demands are so key when people are being marginalized, underserved, and exploited. That is necessary. But the point with everyday resistance, I think, is that the research is showing that people that are subordinated, they have a hidden transcript or discourse that is going on where there is a lot of exchange of practices of what to do, stories, rumors, legends, and these things feed into a more improvisation of where individuals in the thousands are doing small scale things that looks mundane and non-important. But when you add it, that so many people are doing it, it is kind of the level where all of us are activists at some point. I mean, we just have to think about the teenager. I mean, the teenager is an expert in avoiding the regime of the parents. So they are very skilled at everyday resistance.
Yeah, as a former teacher, I can tell you that that's my least favorite group to have worked with because they're so good at resisting me.
Yeah. So my point here is that we are sometimes, when we talk about resistance, we are preoccupied with the public articulation, the organized articulation on the street or in a formal grouping.
Mm-hmm.
But there is a very interesting intelligence to the idea of pretending that you are obeying the orders and respecting the authority, be that parents or bosses or something. But when you have the opportunity, you're undermining that authority. So because you then avoid the heavy repression that might be the cost of resistance.
Yes, that's actually a great point. So it's also part of, if we're thinking about this as a system, right? Like that resistance happens at all of these layers. We've been talking about the different layers in different ways, but there is overlap between them, right? So if we're organized as a group and we know that there are individuals in organizations who feel the same way that we do on the outside, but they're in the organization, right? Being able to find those folks and collaborate with them in ways that allows us to have an inside outside strategy where they're doing things in the organization, whether formal or informal, and we're reinforcing that outside the organization in different ways and vice versa. And I think that it's something that there are a couple of layers to this. So we all have to figure out what we're willing to risk, right? So the without knowing what we're willing to risk, sometimes we'll put ourselves in situations that we weren't prepared for. And so figuring out what we're willing to risk so we can figure out what on the spectrum of resistance where we live in any given moment. So if I use myself as an example, in my earlier days of my career, I spoke up, but it wasn't as forcefully, right? Because I'm new, I'm the person, I have to earn my keep and all of those other things. But I found other ways to kind of push back that were less visible. And so developing policies and procedures within different initiatives and departments that I was a part of, that kind of opened up the door for equity to happen in ways that weren't obvious, right? So playing with language a little bit, kind of adjusting, doing things that were labeled, oh, this is about community, the community learning about what we do. We should have tours and stuff. And really, it's about the community understanding this is how this works, right? You need to understand how this works so that when you don't get what you need, then you have the ability to articulate very explicitly the thing that is not working. And so really kind of being creative with where those points that are more visible, where I know that I'm putting myself on the line here, right? So that's more kind of what I did later in my career. And then kind of on the other end of the spectrum, although I didn't have, I hadn't gotten there yet, but I was still doing these things in my roles that I did have in my circle of influence and direct control that I was able to that I was able to shift the dynamics of in protest, in resistance to how things usually happened.
Right. And if you don't have that mutual support of people, and if you don't have the kind of preparation of laying the ground and opening up doors before you step up and articulate a protest, you might be heavily punished.
Mm-hmm.
And we see that very much when it comes to whistleblowers. I think that's an extreme example, but in corporations or the military or the police, when someone is a whistleblower, they might reveal something of the injustices of those organizations that are very important for the public. But the research is showing that they are, without exception, they're always heavily punished, even when they are right.
Mm-hmm.
So the cost could be tremendous. So I think we need to understand that it's actually something more geared towards those that are privileged in society, that have networks, education, and all that to take the risk of going out to the street to confront the bosses, to articulate the critique, because they can afford to lose.
Mm-hmm.
So, and despite this, we see that it's the most subordinated people that are the basis of rebellions and resistance when we see real transformation in society. And that's, for me, astonishing, because, I mean, those are the people that really have something to lose. But we make a mistake, and we will not understand when and where they're coming from, these major rebellions, if we don't understand that there is an ongoing culture of everyday hidden forms of resistance that is sustaining this possibility of collective eruptions.
But to be really clear here for our audience, that means that millions, even billions of people around the world are perhaps unknowingly engaged in everyday resistance, correct?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, that's amazing. That's amazing for the amount of potential. That's absolutely incredible. Another thing I'd like to kind of work into our conversation here is advancing racial equity is scary and sometimes dangerous. Resistance is scary and sometimes dangerous. You're both involved in these things. What is it that keeps you coming back, that that lights that fire to do all of the things that you do? And honestly, straight to the audience, the two people I have here with me are some of the busiest people I've met. They've always got tons of stuff going on, so I actually want to know, because I don't have that much energy. So
Stellan?
Well, I can say I'm brought up in a family that had a counterculture, hippie New Agers, but so it taught me that I don't have to live like everyone else. But I think what happened with me in my teens, when I started to get involved in activism, was the relationships with people, particularly later on in the global south, and migrants that were fleeing from dictatorships and poverty. Those kind of relationships have always sustained me, and giving models and examples of what to do. And I think what kind of motivates me fundamentally is this feeling of responsibility. I mean, I'm born without having chosen it. I'm born into one of those privileged positions of a white middle-class cis male. That is the big problem in the world today, that is exploiting the majority of people and destroying the future of our environment. So it feels like I need to take that kind of responsibility. But I would say that what sustains me is the relationships to people that I find so admirable and amazing in the resistance in India, in South Africa, Egypt, Palestine, that I have relationships too.
It's really fascinating. How about yourself, Dr. Martin?
So for me, so first I want to say that resistance and advancing racial equity are not different, right? Like their resistance is an important part of advancing racial equity. So I just want to be, I don't want to artificially separate the two. And so for me, I've been fascinated with understanding racism, what it is, and how it works since I was a kid. In elementary school, actually, I was in like my first school experience, kindergarten, when it was like first became really available in Boston public schools. And I had a horrible kindergarten experience. My teacher, I was the only Black kid in the class. I was always getting teased. And that didn't bother me so much as the teacher kind of reinforcing it. So then I was always getting in trouble because other people were doing things to me. And it got to a point where I basically told my mother that I did not want to go anymore. And so she pulled me out the school, to her credit, so that I didn't have to keep dealing with that every day. And it was fascinating to me. Like at the time, I'm a 5-year-old, right? It was fascinating to me that I didn't really understand the nuances or the complexity of it, but it was just fascinating to me about the illogicalness of it. Like I just didn't understand it. It didn't make any sense to me.
Right.
And so as I became fixated on it in a lot of ways. And so, growing up, I was always reading books about, activism and protesting and racism and oppression and all of those things. And really, the next, I think, evolution for me was, when my husband and I, started a family, and it was, well, we have 5 kids, 2 still at home. And how are we going to raise 5 Black children in a society that is constantly working its hardest to have them boxed into this narrowly framed identity that's going to try to communicate constantly to them that they shouldn't have any dignity or respect, or they don't have humanity that should be respected. How do you prepare children to go out into the world and not just survive, right? Like I didn't want them to just be surviving. So for me, it was really about building their skills to thrive, and reach their full human potential in the face of all that the world was going to put out there against them, and in recognition that it's systemic, right? And they're going to face it at every turn. So for me, it was really my deepest learning came from just trying to figure that out, and figure out what our family culture was to be able to ward off those things. And to Stellan's point, we've seen the difference in kind of our children's ability to navigate in spaces without fear and speak up and advocate for themselves, even with the teachers and things like that. And so I think, it's been a reinforcing thing that actually has taught me probably more than any, training or course or any one book, but just the study of trying to create that kind of culture as a family. Is probably the best lessons that I've had.
I mean, that's so fascinating to me that you both said family, community, relationships, and that resonates really deeply with me because I've never felt more in community with people than I have engaging in the work that we do. And that's really striking to me in contrast with everything I see happening in the world around us right now. I know there's a lot of people that are feeling unmoored, kind of off balance, isolated, even alone, and kind of helpless. Like, what can I really do? So, because we're so lucky to have 2 such passionate people here about resistance, about advancing racial equity, what kind of threads can we give to people to latch onto so that they can really connect with other people and, I don't know, start feeling like they have the agency to actually make change that they want to see?
I would say that one thing is to understand that there are a couple of things that are very intelligent with the world system of imperialism and colonialism that we're living in now. And one of the things that is very, very skilled in a way it's being applied is to create individualism in the way that we are broken out from our communities and create divisions between us according to race, gender, sexuality in different ways, so that we are not being united and in a struggle against the privileged very few people that are exploiting and gaining on the present system. So I think it is at the core of resistance and transformation to understand that it is in community with others, particularly when it bridges over and create alliances. That is when we are able to really make a difference, because we are going against the logic of the system that separates us.
Yes, I completely agree with that. I think, it brings up a point around, going back to the point of us having this conversation is that, at least for me, is that, racism exists, oppression exists, right? And so we're talking about the strategies to deal with that. And in order to deal with a problem, we need to really understand what the problem is and how it works. And one of the things that is really, I think, what a lot of people struggle with, and I struggled with it for a while, and sometimes I have my moments even now, as a Black person who identifies as African American, is this weird dynamic where we're on the receiving end of racism, we're the oppressed, and watching white people get hustled by racism, right? It's called strategic racism, where other folks know that that all of us are infected with these ideas, and some of us don't realize, many of us actually don't realize how infected we are, and how they're you hear a lot on the news channels, the talking heads talking about dog whistles. What they're really talking about is the fact that we've all been conditioned in society to think about different groups in different ways. And there's certain language that you can use that you don't have to be explicit about who you're talking about. All you need to say is certain phrases that triggers an idea about who we're actually talking about. So when we say things like inner city and urban, everyone, oh, Black people, Latinx people, oh, that poor people, that's who we're talking about, right? And so that's not me, that's those people. And so I don't need to worry about that issue, or I should be concerned that they're getting things in the way that the issues get framed. And what's the problematic about that is then we don't see, I'm not white, but white people then do not see the fact that the issues that they think are about other people are actually impacting them too, right? And when you can't see that connection, you make decisions, you go along with things because of how someone else framed it for you, and it actually turns out to be harmful. So a concrete example would be Obamacare versus Affordable Care Act, right? Everyone thought that those were different things. Like the Affordable Care Act was the stuff that white people had, right? The Obamacare was like that other stuff that like those people had. So we can get rid of that thing because that's for those people. And in going along with that narrative, end up almost have arrived at the precipice of losing healthcare benefits that are literally saving people's lives. And even more significant in this moment of COVID-19 and being in a pandemic, right? And so so I'll say this race to the bottom, where middle class and poor white people are competing with people of color, and missing the fact that the 1% of the entire United States, I'm using United States context, has most of the wealth of this entire country. And I'll share a link with folks here shortly, but I also want to share these books if you want to learn more. Let's see. So this is The Invention of the White Race. And there's 2 volumes to it. This first volume talks about racial oppression and social control, and why there was even this concept of whiteness and white people created, as part of what Stellan was talking about earlier. And then volume 2 of that book really gets to how the Anglo Americans then further took it to the next level in the United States. And so I just share that as we think about reframing, the understanding of the problem that we're actually trying to solve for, and that white people involved in the struggle should not be involved in it to save people of color, but to save themselves, because they too are kind of in this weird position of receiving benefits in terms of privileges that are really crumbs in comparison with the folks who are really fully benefiting from the entire system, right? And so I'll stop there.
Well, but I think you bring up an interesting point, because many criticisms have been leveled at, for example, DEI efforts. A lot of people have recognized after so many years of DEI programs that actually the greatest beneficiaries of DEI programs are white women rather than people of color. So as we're engaging in resistance and trying to advance racial equity, how is it that we can monitor ourselves or check in with ourselves to make sure that we are not accidentally, unintentionally re-injecting those elements of domination or some kind of supremacy ideas, behaviors, attitudes in trying to make things better?
Easy question. Stellan's got this. Go ahead, Stellan.
Yeah. So I would say kind of two things. One is that because there's a historical long tradition of different forms of domination, and because they are taking place within us, as Atyia is saying, is infecting us as individuals, particularly people like me. I'm Scandinavian, but I'm passing as white. Then there is constantly always going to be reappearing when we create new institutions and solutions. There will be a reappearance of sexism or class racism again and again, right? So that's kind of one thing of it. The other point I would like to make is that I think that the leadership of transformation needs to be with those people that are being subordinated by the system. So it needs to be Black, Indigenous, people of color that are in the leadership of the change. So that will help us to not create false solutions. So, for example, in resistance movements and mobilizations, I think it's important to get away with this tendency of people like me, professional white middle-class people, taking leadership positions of organizations. It should instead be people of BIPOC background. I think that would at least help us, but I think we need to be clear that there is a social and individual transformation that needs to be happening here as well. There isn't only a solution that is about laws and institutions and new policies. It's also about me, Stellan.
So that's really fascinating because at All Aces, one of the things that Atyia's work has really centered on is it's really hard to change a group of people. Like, we actually can't change people, but we can change ourselves. So if we've got a whole bunch of people who are actively trying to work on themselves, then that is something that you can work with.
Yep.
So I'm kind of wondering how that shows up in various actions and instances of resistance.
So I want to speak to this idea of because if I understood your question, your first question correctly, you were asking what we need to do to manage ourselves better, right?
Yep.
I'm synthesizing, and I think part of this really is about so what I find fascinating about racism and oppression in general is so there's a systemic nature of it when you have all the institutions and everything reinforcing. And part of that systemic piece is us as people, right? And I know we don't usually talk about it in that way. Like, we are part of, all of us are part of the system. People of color, like we're all part of that system. And the question is, what are we doing as being part of the system? So institutions are ran by people, they're created by people, policies are created by people. Like, we do all of those things, and there's kind of this reinforcement of history and this long set of policies and practices we've had over the years that were intentionally created to be racist, to be sexist, to be classist, all those things, and now have morphed into, well, if you, all you have to do is just keep doing what we've been doing. And by virtue, you're extending all of those policies. And so when we think about what we can do ourselves, the multiple layers, one is racial equity literacy. Like, I know it's easy to like read an article and learn some vocabulary and feel like we got it. But that's not it, right? There's a whole historical context that we need to understand. I'm not saying everyone needs to be a historian, but we do need to understand the historical context of how we got here, right? why does the world look the way it does today? Well, where we have this hierarchy, this social hierarchy that we've created. We need to better understand ourselves and who we are and how we work. I wish in schools we actually had classes on these things where it's like, oh, understanding neuroscience and psychology and sociology in the context of who we are as people, so that we understand why we do what we do, why we don't do the things that we would like to do, and what are the things that we can do to manage ourselves better. And what I will share with folks is a lot of this is about some skills that I think are foundational skills to progress us just in general in our human development, right? In our human development. So that gets to beyond racial equity and literacy. Now we're talking about emotional intelligence. Why do I feel what I feel? What emotions are behind that? Where is that coming from, so that I can translate that into information that helps me better understand what's happening in the moment and why I might react or not react in a certain way, so that I can manage that better, right? What does that mean in terms of relationships and how I am paying attention to other people's emotional states and how I'm influencing that and managing myself better in those interactions. And then the other piece is really around communication. How do we communicate better with each other? Someone had asked the question earlier of kind of how do we build relationships with individuals, so there's a foundation to build from and overcome resistance, right? This idea that we are able to really build our emotional intelligence, that helps, but also that we're able to communicate well with each other, that we're first are able to communicate well with ourselves, and then to be able to communicate well with other folks, to be able to have critical thinking skills, right? So that we don't fall into the silly mental potholes or traps that we all fall into on a regular basis. But when we have to make decisions, and when we have to engage with other people, that we're getting present in the moment and really putting those skills into place so that we can manage ourselves better. And then the last one being Rico's favorite topic, conflict management, right?
Hey.
Right, because we're inevitably going to come into conflict with each other, because we're in conflict is not a bad thing, right? Productive conflict helps us clarify. It helps us better understand each other if we're willing to go through the process that it takes to get there, right? And then that gets to this whole piece around how we show up in spaces. We can't be afraid of making other people uncomfortable, right? And at the same time, to Stellan's point, we have to figure out what we're willing to risk, what we can risk in any given moment, so that we can match our response in a way that is strategic. And so some things are more overt, some things are more covert that we might have to do, but in essence, that we always walk away from situations or interactions in a way where our dignity is left intact. And that's one of the ways that racism and systems of oppression kind of strip away at our health, is that that stress of having to be in these interactions, especially for people of color, the stress of it and having to find the words, and do I speak up on this, or was that really about race, or is that something else, or that whole process literally is taking years off of our life and causing health problems. And so for us to build these skills is also an important strategy as we're trying to create the world we want and work towards the world we want. We also have to have strategies for dealing with the world as it is, if nothing else, as a mental health strategy.
Yeah. Sorry, normally I'm better at processing things on my feet, but I guess not just then. But I do want to make sure that we have some time, because yesterday I was just thinking, and this is what kind of threw me off. Yesterday we did a little promo for this event, and I believe I made some promises to people, as in like we could help people to figure out who they can talk to or groups they can connect with, things that they can start reading so that they can get more engaged with things, maybe meet up with other people who can be in community with them to explore the kind of both personal and the outward kind of things that we are, or external rather, things that we're talking about. So I know that, Stellan, you are involved in a couple upcoming actions. And Atyia, I know you're involved with the Black Boston COVID Coalition. So I don't know if you would like to talk about those groups in a little more detail, or to just kind of address the, what we're talking about more generally.
So I could say that I think there's a lot of attention right now, and understandably, on the election and the president post, who is going to be there and how that affects us. But the kind of activism that I'm concerned with, and that I think we could have a workshop about, and where I know that people are struggling with, is more community oriented in the way we have said, more social justice oriented, that is trying to change here and now the different injustices that exist. So I mean, I'm involved in the preparations for direct actions and resistance against the pipeline in Minnesota that goes through Anishinaabe territory, which is building us in more in the fossil situation and destruction of the climate. And I think that what would be really helpful would be to together think about how we could be more creative, more oriented towards community, as we have been talking about here, and finding ways of doing resistance that is more geared towards building empowerment of communities, instead of being stuck in this kind of self-defeating orientation of constantly making demands and protesting on those people in power, which is something that needs to be done. But if we get stuck into that, I think we lose a lot of our capacity, the health that you talk about, Atyia, that we need to preserve our own energy and health in the struggle, because it's a long-term struggle. We need to be more finding ways of doing community empowerment.
Absolutely. I completely agree with that. And I think, part of it, I'm always reading books, y'all. Y'all already know, for folks who are familiar with me, there's always books everywhere. And one of the books that recently had me more consciously thinking about this is one where they were talking about kind of how movements spark and some of the consequences for when those movements get going, and the repression that happens from government and all types of things. And the thing that stuck out to me, so that and your conversation, was it Dr. Pugh? Is that
yeah,
Dr. Pugh. So with Dr. Pugh was this whole idea around there's the government, and we need the government, and the government's great and all that stuff. And government needs a counterbalance. Infrastructure of businesses, nonprofits, they need a counterbalance, because when we don't have collective efforts and actions happening in community, then no one is, for lack of better terms, afraid of not doing the right thing. No one's afraid to do things that aren't promising or best practices. Just do whatever they come up with, right? That's good enough. And so it's important that we're able to be that counterbalance, and have and create our own infrastructure to fill in the gaps, to offset the gaps that are happening in communities. And I know folks are like, that's not fair and all those other things, but we don't live in a fair world. And so the opportunities that we have to figure out how we can do things in communities, with ourselves, for ourselves, in absence, while we're also trying to hold government accountable, right? This is where that complexity comes in, of respecting that there's all of these angles that we have to come at it, and that's one of them. Which brings me to my last point, which is that there's a place for everyone. Like there's resistance that advances racial equity and social justice, um, roles that everyone can play, right, in order to be disruptors of oppression. And so figuring out what that means for you, figuring out your style and your voice, and how you're going to move in the space, is going to be probably the biggest and greatest investment. It's hard work. It's invigorating, and it's even better when we do it in community with other people. So I invite folks to intentionallyact.com as one of the places that we're trying to create the space for us to be able to learn from each other, support one another as we are trying to navigate in what can oftentimes feel overwhelming and can create these feelings of hopelessness and helplessness, which is not true, right? Which is that there's a lot that we can be doing. It's just really hard to see because we don't have these kind of conversations often. And it's not like you watch movies and it's like, oh, resistance right there on TV, right? So it's not, we're not primed to be thinking consciously about these nuanced ways and even some of the more vocal ways that communities come together to advocate for what they want and what they need, in addition to filling some of those gaps.
Yeah, and we need training and inspiring examples in order to see where to go. And I would like to just mention the community in Dudley Street in Boston that is trying to be community land trusts and the different ways of building a multiracial community based on the Black community that is there. And the Corporation Jackson in Mississippi, the way that they are also doing that kind of community empowerment, showing a model for us. So we can get inspiration from these kind of examples, I think.
Yeah. And that's the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, the SNI.
Yeah.
So I know that we always try to land these shows on hope. I like to do a little bit of collecting of some major themes for our audience, if we can. So one takeaway I think that's important is everyday resistance is something that literally billions of us are engaged in every day, meaning that a lot of us are actually already activists.
Yep.
And throughout this conversation, hopefully we've surfaced some things that can help people to understand how they can go beyond that. Another big takeaway is that, in fact, DEI is not advancing racial equity because DEI is not resistance, but racial equity is. Did I get that right?
Yeah. I think we could say it that way. And I would reframe it to say that traditional DEI, and for context, what we tend to do is our discomfort with talking about racism and explicitly the experiences of people of color. And it gets even more uncomfortable when we start talking about Black people for reasons we don't have time to get into here. That facilitates a lot of DEI work to be about like diversity in general and like differences, and we want diverse hires. It's like, well, you have to define those things in terms of the context of what you're looking for in the organization. They have to be specific goals, and we didn't talk a lot about organizational development and responsibilities and all of this too, but that's part of the context. And so racial equity usually gets left off the table. And one of the ways it happens is with this language around intersectionality. And as we were talking about before, Rico, we say, oh, well, we shouldn't just talk about race or racism because, intersectionality. So let's talk about this other thing that I feel more comfortable talking about, as opposed to what intersectionality was intended to be about, which is understanding how when you add race into another identity, a form of oppression, how it creates this unique type of experience for people within that context. So the LGBTQI experience, and then there's the Latinx LGBTQI experience, right? Those are two different things, and to be respectful of that reality. So thank you for allowing me the opportunity to clarify, Rico.
I appreciate it. Any last words of hope for the audience to stick with them throughout the rest of the day and their week?
I would say the last word that I think it's in when we are acting together in resistance against different forms of domination. That's when we can find the empowerment in community that is needed.
Hmm. And I'll just say, I'm just sending lots of love, hope, and action, as always, to everyone. That we have, there's all kinds of power, not just the traditional ones we tend to focus on, and for us to lean into our power and our agency.
And just to make it really clear for the audience at home, we're not saying this and just go out into the world. Of course, you can connect with us directly on our Facebook pages. This is streaming from the All Aces Facebook page, the Resistance Studies Initiative Facebook page, and a number of other pages. So please do get at us. I will be coming back to the questions and the comments later on. So you've got our faces and our names. Say hi. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you so much, Stellan, and thank you, Atyia, for coming on the show and clarifying a lot of things for me personally. I hope for everybody else as well. And as Dr. Atyia Martin loves to say, everybody have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.